Hey everyone, how's it going? Okay, so my name is Andrew. I'm the developer advocate over here at Adyen. A little bit about myself. Let's get started. My background is I used to be a teacher at a boot camp for software engineering. Used to come from also a background of online learning, built a few courses for front-end engineering, those kind of things. And now I'm here as a developer advocate over here on the San Francisco Adyen team. What we kind of work on is everything touching developer experience. So, what can we do to make developer experience the best possible experience when integrating with Adyen, right? When working with our APIs, our technologies, those kinds of things. So everything's in terms of, example integrations, documentation, events like this, everything touching the developer experience, we work on. So for tonight, we have a pretty cool event coming up. We have Etsy we have engineers from Etsy, our global marketplace, here to talk about a few of the technologies powering payments. Imran, did you want to give a quick introduction to yourself before we begin?
Yeah, sounds good. Hi, I'm Pratap Singh. I'm one of the engineers on the payments team. I've been at Etsy for a little more than 3 years now, and worked on most part of our payment stack, including our shop payment finances, taxes, and a pretty recent expansion of our Etsy payments platform to new countries.
Hey, I'm Imran Hussain. I'm also an engineer on the Etsy payments team. I've been at Etsy for 3 years now. And we work on everything from pay-ins to payouts and everything kind of in between. We deal with a lot of onboarding and stuff like that. And obviously PCI, which you'll hear about shortly.
Awesome, pretty cool stuff. So actually, it's pretty interesting. I see a lot of participants from last year's event also, from last year's Payments Decoded. So this is really awesome to see you guys back onto this one. For those that are joining for the first time, we typically run this event yearly. Last year we held it in San Francisco, invited a ton of data scientists, engineers, architects, developers, that kind of stuff to our event. We have talks like this. We had food, we had drinks and that kind of stuff. Pretty fun environment. We're gonna have a lot of fun today as well. But if you want to see more events like this, if you want to get involved with future feedback sessions, if you want to speak at future events as well, if you have a cool topic to present, definitely would love to hear from you guys. I'm going to drop in a chat right here a few resources that you can reach out to. So we have a forum. This is new from last year as well. I just launched it a couple months ago, that you can reach out to in case you have any feedback for us, any ideas for upcoming events, if you want to get involved, if you want to write a guest blog, that kind of stuff, or if you have feedback about point of sale, plugins, e-commerce platforms, that kind of stuff, feel free to reach out there as well. We also have a newsletter that we just launched. So drop in the link right there in the chat. And there you can kind of see a lot of things. You can get a monthly digest of API updates, upcoming events, library updates, all kinds of cool stuff. So if you kind of want a one-stop shop, newsletter is the place to go. Or if you just want to reach out on social media, we have that as well. So our Adyen Devs channel on Twitter, a lot of stuff on there. We have tips and tricks. We have events that we host, that we promote on there as well. Just all kinds of stuff. So feel free to reach out. Definitely love to hear from you. Definitely would love to keep working together. As for today's event, Etsy prepared a video package. So we'll jump into that one, and then we'll head into a Q&A, so for more interaction. A couple ground rules for that, just two things really. Be respectful. So a lot of people are going to be sharing ideas, sharing comments, questions, that kind of stuff. Just be mindful of each other, increase the welcomeness for participation, that kind of stuff. And also just participate. If you have any questions for Etsy, if you have any questions for us, there is the chat feature at the very bottom over there on your Zoom window. You can ask it in the Q&A section as well. Or if you prefer to, just literally voice out your question, feel free to raise your hand as well, and we can get into that. But without further ado, let's start with the video package right here. Okay, so I'm gonna
Hey everyone, my name is Imran Hussain, and I'm here with Aman Singh to talk about Etsy's PCI environment, how we migrated it from the data center to the cloud, and in doing so, how we reimagined it to reduce Etsy's overall risk without reducing some of the benefits that having this environment has given us. Before we dive into how we went about our architecture and decisioning, I just want to quickly elaborate on what PCI is and why it's important. It stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. In a nutshell, once a business handles, transmits, or stores credit card information, they must be fully compliant to the PCI standards, or payment card brands like Visa or MasterCard and payment service providers will limit the data you can send them to non-sensitive data only. Basically, you can't handle credit card data on your own servers unless you are compliant. Every year, Etsy is assessed to make sure we meet these requirements, and then we provide that compliance sign-off to our payment service providers. Our first PCI environment was set up in 2011 and was a miniature clone of Etsy's infrastructure and application code at the time. Because of the rigorous PCI requirements, we adopted a shared nothing approach, meaning our PCI environment lived in its own locked data center cage, had its own network, monitoring, deployment methods, servers, VPN, basically everything you can think of in a typical application architecture was duplicated and isolated specifically for our PCI environment. We kept PCI and Etsy.com separate because it reduced our overall PCI footprint on what we'd have to be audited yearly on. If we had combined them, it would have made our entire Etsy.com infrastructure and application come under PCI scope, and then we'd have to prove our entire stack was compliant. So we wanted to keep it as small as possible. After building out and maintaining this special environment for so many years, with all the work that went into meeting these requirements, you might be asking, why change it? Well, the answer has two parts. The first being there were drawbacks to having it separate. As we said, PCI has a lot of rules. We had to carefully control who could log into the environment, who could develop on it, who could deploy on it, which made it really hard to maintain over the years. As our main website's code base was improved and actively developed on, the code that existed for PCI was neglected. Being audited yearly is a huge time investment for many people across our business and engineering teams, especially for something that we don't actively work on every day. This led to a lot of scrambling when it came time to produce evidence of compliance. And perhaps the biggest issue we had was just having the special Snowflake infrastructure on the side made it really hard to get clarity and visibility into it because it played by a different set of rules than the rest of Etsy's main application. One example of the issues we had in the PCI environment is we had to reset our password quite often on a different schedule that was specific for PCI. And in order to remind ourselves of that, we'd have recurring calendar invites, which even with those, we found ourselves getting locked out frequently. The only way to resolve this was to find an admin who wasn't locked out to reset us, which was often painful, especially during emergencies. Another example was we used to have laptops separate from our normal ones that were the only devices that could connect to the VPN for this environment, and they were locked in a physical safe in our office. So you can imagine that for getting them in the office would be quite the journey to go back to find it, or to find someone who remembered to take it home during an outage or issue or something like that where we need to deploy code to it. Finally, because PCI required change management procedures for us, that meant we had different developers and different code deployers. This made it hard to align schedules to get code out, especially when today we rely on automated pipelines to push code out. It was just really forgotten about, and the environment just wasn't up to modern standards. Basically, we didn't have a scalable environment. Arguably, this was by design for PCI, but we decided we need to do better. The second driving reason behind our migration was that Etsy began our cloud migration in 2018. That provided us a unique opportunity to use some GCP services, and as a requirement because we were moving out of our data center. Okay, so we had to move our PCI environment one way or another, but we weren't really sure the best way to do that yet. One typical approach might have been to just lift and shift to the cloud. This is the way we did it with Etsy.com, and for the most part, that worked really, really well. So why didn't we follow suit? Well, we'd still have a giant database of credit cards for one thing, and maintaining virtual machines in the cloud versus maintaining them in the data center isn't really that different at the end of the day. It also might not have been the most cost-effective approach for us, as a lot of lift and shift migrations happen to end up being more expensive. So we needed some goals. So we came up with these to help us in determining the best solution. For the first goal, because of our annual audit, we would just love to reduce the amount of time and people involved in that effort. Outside of the investment in the audit, just having a giant database of credit cards alone poses a security risk. Thinking about data breaches from companies in recent times, removing this from our infrastructure would be amazing. Secondly, Etsy has had multiple payment providers for credit cards for a few years now, and we've seen tremendous benefits in being able to have redundancy and the ability to shift traffic around as needed in the event of outages and other transaction routing factors. We wanted to keep this multiple provider paradigm around, and that means we couldn't just use the packaged PCI solution from any single provider. I said earlier that there were a lot of touch points with PCI, like it had its own isolated deployment and monitoring tools and infrastructure, which made maintaining it really hard. Well, we wanted to improve the developer experience as much as possible during this migration so that we could work on it more easily in the future, solving for things like the PSD2 mandate in our European market and secure customer authentication and 3DS when processing transactions. Those were things we'd have to work on really shortly after the migration that we needed to solve for. So just a tiny bit more about some aspects of the PCI spec before we go further. It has a couple of levels when it comes to the type and depth of your annual audit. The PCI standard calls them self-assessment questionnaires, and the highest level is D, which Etsy has to complete because we store and transmit sensitive credit card data. The lowest level is A, or AEP specifically for e-commerce merchants. Merchants that fall under that category typically don't interact directly with the sensitive credit card information and usually iframe or have some JavaScript from the service provider that is fully compliant with PCI already, so that the merchant, or Etsy in this case, doesn't have to assume the risk of handling the sensitive data themselves. So when we were thinking about how to reduce Etsy's PCI risk, a lot of that revolved around minimizing the audit and moving us down the levels of PCI from D to AEP as much as possible. But there were still a few roadblocks with doing that. Like, a lot of the requirements revolved around patching server vulnerabilities, managing encryption keys, making sure credit card numbers aren't being logged, all sorts of things. Well, one reason lift and shift wouldn't work for our goals is if you just fire up VMs on a cloud provider, you're still responsible for patching them and keeping them secure and isolated and making sure they're fully compliant with PCI. So we had to come up with a way to not deal with this aspect of the requirement. Well, what if we had no servers? There's nothing to patch or secure if there's no servers for you to log into or manage. This paradigm of serverless technology is something we embraced throughout the architecture we ended up with. And it helped us significantly. We could get rid of all of our application servers that we constantly had to patch and maintain. That alone would cross things off the PCI audit checklist. Unfortunately, going serverless doesn't solve everything. We'd still have to spin up things like databases. We talked through options like using some managed relational databases like Cloud SQL or Cloud Spanner on Google Cloud Platform, which would have been great since they were managed services. But we realized just having credit cards stored in PCI still leaves a lot to prove when talking about things like encryption of the data at rest and access to that data and the risk of the data leaking out. So that eventually led us to thinking, could we just get rid of our database in our PCI environment? What if we didn't have to store credit card information at all? How could that change the architecture? And to find out how we approach that answer, here's Aman Singh.
Hi, I'm Aman Singh, and yes, we can. In comes token in the process of tokenization. So tokenization refers to replacing sensitive data such as a credit card number with a token that maps to the sensitive data but has no intrinsic value of its own. In our case, we're referring to utilizing our vendors to handle credit card encryption on their end and return to us something that we can keep and pass back to them when we want to charge a card. This is how vendors get out of having a full PCI environment, and this is the path we wanted to explore to help us reduce our risk and our PCI footprint even more. So, how did we architect the system? This is what our basic tokenization flow looks like. The credit card number is received directly by our PCI environment from a buyer's browser, and we send it to our payment processor like Adyen. We utilize their tokenization API to check if the card is valid. This works great, but we don't get the benefits of scaling our payment providers because once we receive a token, we can't change it back into a credit card number to send to another provider if necessary. What we really wanted is a multi-provider tokenization, making sure we can tokenize as fast as possible with a single provider and then asynchronously tokenize with as many providers. So we added PubSubs into our architecture to account for n number of tokenizations as well as retries during outages. So the credit card number is received directly by our PCI environment from a buyer's browser before we send it to our payment provider like Adyen as before. This response from Adyen is returned directly back to our Etsy domain. Within our PCI environment, we also asynchronously tokenize with other payment providers and push these tokens directly to our Etsy domain at a different endpoint. So if provider A has an outage, we can still retry the transaction provider B, which we asynchronously tokenize with. We also added KMS encryption to all our message processing, such that any communication between this environment and our Etsy domain is KMS encrypted. KMS allows us to easily do things like rotating the keys and encrypting messages on the fly. We also wanted to scrub our logs, making sure we redact any information that we do not want logged, and added Google DLP into the mix. DLP allows us to remove any PCI-sensitive information that we could accidentally log. We don't want to bring any shared Etsy.com tooling under PCI scope for things like deployment, and hence utilize Cloud Build and GitHub to run our Terraform pipelines, which manage GCP infrastructure, as well as our code deployments to App Engine. Locking who can merge into our production branch to a specific group allows us to meet the PCI requirement of separation of concerns between those who write code and others who can deploy the code. So that's pretty much our slimmed down serverless no database architecture. Some things we learned throughout the process: having and maintaining a PCI environment is a lot of work. Don't do it unless you have to, but having one does allow benefits at scale. You still will have to prove that you aren't responsible for maintaining all the things PCI compliance requires. We did this by utilizing our PCI compliance documents from Google. Using tokens have other benefits, like account updater flows from our vendors. For instance, Adyen will automatically update tokens when expiration dates change, or if an account number changes without us having to change our tokens, which is super handy. We know that's a ton of information about our PCI environment's history and current architecture. So thanks for listening. If there are any questions, we can answer a few.
Cool. So Imran, Aman, thank you so much for the presentation. At this point, for the next probably half hour or 45 minutes or so, I definitely want to turn it to Q&A. So as a quick reminder, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Preferably, if you can, definitely use the Q&A tab at the bottom as well. Etsy engineers are here to answer your questions and get a good conversation going. So from here, I'm going to turn it to you guys. Loving the emojis right there, mind blown and all that.
Yeah, I can take this question. Actually, does everyone see that? I'm not sure actually if everyone sees that or not, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So the question is, you mentioned separate laptops in first version of your stack. What was that solving? What is different in the new stack that solved this? Cool. So having separate laptops was a little, I don't know, I think it's taking it to the extreme. I don't think anything in the PCI spec actually says you need to have separate laptops. But if you take the whole concept of a shared nothing environment that we talked about a little earlier in the deck, and 8-9 years ago, Etsy was a lot younger, so it was just a lot easier to separate everything out. It allowed us to show our assessor during the audit that it really is a shared nothing environment. To get access to the environment, we literally have to open a safe, go pull out a laptop, log into that laptop, and that's how you gain access to it. In the new environment, how we got rid of that is we tried to stress that there really is no network to log into, which is why we kind of embraced serverless, and that kind of got rid of the need for a separate laptop or a separate VPN profile, or basically there's nothing to log into. So how do I show you that that there's something that I need to keep separate for access restrictions and stuff like that? So the one caveat we ran into, just thinking about how we prevent access to something, is you can still log into the Google Cloud Platform UI, and so we had to think about ways where we could either get that out of scope or just talk about why it didn't matter. And then so for us, the way we approached that was, we said no human in this PCI environment has access to do anything. So we used IAM profiles, which is like identity access management. I think it's the same across AWS and GCP. But we really use that to restrict what any human could do versus any robot account. So the robot accounts are like typical service accounts that are attached to things like Cloud Build and App Engine, and what else? PubSub. Those are the things that can do more than just read. And if they can't manipulate the PCI environment, then that's how we showed that there's really nothing that we need separate access or separate VPN to get access to this environment. So that's really the difference between why we needed laptops in the first stack versus the current environment.
Okay, I see there are a few questions coming in through Q&A and through the chat.
I can answer one of those. So the question is, along with credit card tokens, do you still store part of the credit card number like the PIN or the last 4 digits? Does this impact PCI scope? We store last 4 and like the type of card. And no, that does not impact PCI scope. So we can actually store that stuff outside of our PCI environment.
Yeah, and that's typically, so when we used to have a database in our PCI environment, we kind of duplicated that information there, just keep it all together. But we always stored bin, tail, I guess that's pretty much it, card name, I guess, billing address, stuff like that in our normal environment. Because one, it doesn't fall under the PCI scope as long as you don't store it with the middle, whatever number is there. But yeah, so it never really affected us. And during our PCI assessments, that never really comes up at all. It's really more about like, what do you do with the CVC number, security code, right? I think one time I got asked a trick question of like, so you store CVC here, and I had to, they try to trick you into answering that incorrectly just to see what what you store in those environments. But yeah, so no, it hasn't affected our assessment at all.
Cool. So let me see. I saw another question that was sent to panelists. So maybe this one wasn't in the public chat, but it's from Caleb. Do you consider tokenizing with the browser or the app? What pros and cons do you see with this approach?
Yeah, I can start that answer, and then Aman, if you want to follow up with anything, you can. So I think when we tried to reduce our scope of PCI from SAQ-D to SAQ-AEP, that kind of led into, can we just use a package solution from our vendor? And what that really amounts to is using like an Adyen SDK or iframe to consume the credit card from the client or app themselves, so that Etsy and none of our servers interact with it at all. We just get a token back through some kind of like post message from the SDK or iframe, and then we can pass it around because it's not sensitive. What pros and cons do we see with this approach? So if we were going with a single vendor and that was okay for us, I could see probably more pros than cons with the approach, because you really get to reduce your liability. And in some ways, it's a lot easier to just implement an SDK or iframe from something like Adyen or another vendor, and then just pass it back to them in how you authorize the token or whatever. But because we have decided that we want multiple payment processors on our end, we decided that either wrapping 2 vendor SDKs or iframes, or finding ways to pass the credit card to one and then keep it in the client and then pass it to another. There were a lot of, I don't want to say risks. Well, there are risks with that, because we shouldn't really be writing our own JavaScript to interact with the sensitive credit card information, because that's some gray area on if we fall under a higher assessment or not. But thinking about things like client reliability, like if one vendor is down and you have to retry that, like we just saw a lot of loopholes where we could lose a token or a credit card number before we were finished getting what we need to actually process the payment. So for us, there were too many cons with doing a full JavaScript client-based approach. Whereas when we consume, when we have our own application consuming the credit card number, we can send it to vendor A, vendor B, vendor C, or do whatever we need behind the scenes in order to guarantee that we have at least a token. And we can retry it because we have PubSub and stuff to make sure we get a number of other tokens.
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered it. Yeah, there's retriability, definitely with multiple providers, having something in the browser and doing it that makes it much more complicated. It's entirely possible, though, that in the future we do include something like that, where for our market, if we only have a single provider, we might have a solution like that. But for us, where we have multiple providers in the market, we definitely want to tokenize it with all of them. And for that, doing it by browser side is like not ideal.
Cool. Excellent. We had another question from a little bit earlier. Ross asked, is the PCI accreditation process ready for serverless / cloud-based architectures? And I'll repost that again right in the chat.
Yeah. So the answer is not yet. It was so right now PCI is on version like 3.1.2 or something like that. At least it was when we went through our last assessment in February. I'm not sure how close they are to 4, but 4 is supposed to be more cloud supportive. It's supposed to remove a lot of the data center terminology, which we found was probably the hardest thing to convince our assessor that like you can't really bring the same data center terminology like I don't know, like the data center locked, you have to have these servers locked in the data center cage to what does that mean in the cloud, right? And yeah, I think that was the hardest thing. I think from working with Google that and like Etsy's not on these councils, but I know like cloud providers like Google and Amazon and probably Microsoft are on, I think they are on the PCI council or whatever boards have influence over the DSS versions. And I know that they are working, especially since they're all cloud providers, they are working to bring the assessors up to a more modern age when they are verifying that people are compliant, or companies are compliant, so that it's not as difficult as it was. I think one of the hardest things we had to do, well, every time you make a material change to PCI, in our case, it was just rebuilding it in the cloud. You're supposed to get reassessed. It just happened to coincide with our yearly assessment, so we didn't have to do like an ad hoc one. But just, you know, convincing him that of serverless paradigms, like I think one of the questions were, how do you prove that all your traffic outbound is like TLS 1.2? And you know, typically in our last assessments, we would do something like run Wireshark on some traffic and verify that the TLS 1.2 packets are there or something like that. And you know, in this case, we had to stress that like there's nothing for us to log into in a serverless environment to even start a program like that to give you evidence of that. So like proving that you can't do something is actually quite hard. But we kind of relied on the fact that no human can access the environment through our IAM permissioning, and Google is compliant at the like they're responsible for that level of infrastructure. Like we're responsible for things that we can control through the through our UI and through the project console that they give us. But anything below that, like here, this is their compliance attestation, and you're just going to have to believe us. And, you know, I mean, after some back and forth, like that actually works, which was really nice.
Cool, awesome. Had another question from a little bit earlier. So thanks for your patience on this one. Shangmin asked, how do you get the account updates from the other providers? What will you do if there's a mismatch in the updates from different vendors?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And you know, I'll say that we don't necessarily have account updates on for all of our vendors that I think of. I actually don't know the answer to that, but let's assume that we don't. And Adyen updates a token for us because they get a new account number or new expiration date from our vendor. And so that token is updated behind the scenes. And then someone on Etsy tries to check out, like, if let's say it was the expiration number, they like, and it was in the past, they wouldn't be able to check out anyways until they updated it. And the way we interact with our with Adyen and our other vendors is like we always send them the expiration date, even when we pass them the token instead of the credit card number. And if there's a mismatch between what they say the token has and what we say the token has, I believe that what we say takes precedence. And if it's in the future, they will apply our update to the token. And then beyond that, it still goes downstream to the bank, and it'll either be rejected or declined. Things like account numbers, like I know with like Adyen that if they do some like retries behind the scenes on some transactions. So like there's like an uplift if like immediately you get declined. I know that there's some like back-end magic that they do, and I'm sure our other vendors do, that will like retry a transaction without us having to specify like, here's the updated information. But I mean, it could get up to date, it could get out of date, especially on things like that we don't collect again from the user, like credit card number. But I don't think we've seen a case where the credit card number has changed in the transaction, or like the token wasn't updated behind the scenes. Yeah, or I guess I would add that our use of account updater, like it's a cool thing. Our use of it is still pretty new, so it's something we'll definitely keep in mind in the future, though.
Great, yeah, great questions, great answers, guys. Had another one from a little bit earlier as well. Lucas asked, you said you had separate code base in your original PCI implementation, but also mentioned that again as a benefit in the new stack. So what was different?
Yeah, I can take that one. So in the old environment, we literally just forked our code base 8 years ago, and that fork became our PCI implementation. So if any domain changes happened within that fork, like it would be a pretty massive effort to sort of change that. In the new environment, what we did was we went ahead and started everything from scratch, and we built everything so lightweight using PHP Slim framework and APIs, such that any changes that we needed to make could be done pretty efficiently. And that sort of reduced like 8 years of our tech debt and started fresh, right? Another advantage of that is that in the old environment, we had our separate hosted GitHub environment that was hosting our PCI code base. Now it's all part of just Git. We don't need to provision separate VPNs for people to be able to access this separate environment that nobody really knows how to keep track of, especially for our infra teams. Like it's pretty difficult. However, now with the new environment, it's just a simple Git repo that's privately owned, and we can just add whoever we need to, and they can start pushing code to it.
Yeah, I guess I would add there that the deployment style changed as well, and where we put the source code for that kind of led into that approach. So in the old environment, again, it was separated. We couldn't use any of our CI/CD infrastructure. And so we had some rsync scripts that you ran on like a deployment host, and it just rsynced the files out to all of our web servers. And again, like that wouldn't work with our serverless paradigm, because the moment you have something to log into, the moment you have to fill out another section of the assessment, and it's just not something we wanted to do. So because we went with this idea that there's nothing for us to log into, we used Google Cloud Build to just pull the source code down. And because Google Cloud Build had the correct IAM permissioning, it was the only thing that could actually deploy code to the to App Engine. So that why we moved the source code and redid it is because you know, there's thousands of lines of code in Etsy Web, and hosting all that in Cloud Build and deploying all that out, it was just a lot easier to start fresh.
Cool. A couple other questions just came in, actually. This is really good stuff. Xiangmin also asked, how do you test different payment methods in production? Do you sell a lot in different countries?
Yes, we do sell a lot in different countries. We actually recently just added 8 or 9 more of them. How do we test them? Well, I guess it's multiple steps. First, we have unit tests that run on our individual code base, like our individual components that we create. We have integration tests running on top of that, which would do things like full-scale transactions and see how those work. Before we deploy code, we manually test things. We have a staging environment where we test things, where we could test different types. We have credit cards, PayPal, Klarna, Google Pay, Apple Pay. So we can individually test each of those. And then when we actually come to production, we have test shops that we use that we buy things from, see how the traffic is flowing, and then monitoring. Like a lot of our testing is done by monitoring things when we deploy code. For example, in PCI, we can use stack driver logs and stack driver alerts to see if something was merged to master, how exactly that impacted traffic and incoming requests and so on. And same for our Etsy web environment. Anytime we deploy code, we have graphs that tell us how things are looking, if requests are up or down. Same for our payment providers and payment processors. If any of them have an outage and stuff, or if we deployed a new API, how is that impacting our traffic? So all of that stuff is pretty visible to us.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there is one of the benefits of slimming down our PCI environment and embracing tokens is that we no longer have to use the PCI environment to perform authorizations on transactions. Before, all transactions had to flow through our PCI environment because we were dealing with the raw credit card number. So they would proxy through that environment. We would, string replace the token indicator with a credit card number, and then pass that on to a vendor like Adyen. Whereas now we could bring all that code that does authorizations and just passes a token into our main application. So it makes it a lot easier to use our testing frameworks and stuff to make sure that those payment methods are correct. But I feel like at the end of the day, testing payments in production is one of the hardest things in the in the world, and I still use my own credit card to test a lot of transactions. And then it just refunds, right? So and that ends up being how we do it. The one tip there is don't use a card that has like foreign fees when you're testing currencies.
You've been there, done that myself too. It's good stuff. Definitely keep the questions coming in. We had another one from Jovan. How long did the audit take from start to finish?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 parts to that. The on-site, when our assessor comes and spends time at Etsy, that period was reduced. Like it used to be a multi-day affair. They'd have to visit our data center in New Jersey or wherever it was. And then we'd have to answer a lot of questions, and they'd have to go through all our policies and talk to different various teams that were involved in the audit process. This time around, pandemic not including the pandemic, we really only spent you know, a day, less than a day, a few handful of hours in the talking to him and explaining the architecture overhaul and talking him through various parts of the PCI spec that we'd have to prove out. But everything after that was just back and forth online. Like we had to produce evidence. So, you know, a lot of that happens offline. But I would say like the actual physical time we spent with the assessor was reduced like significantly because of the change in the large change. We couldn't reuse a lot of our evidence from previous years. So we had to make sure that we had new ones. So a lot of that back and forth led to a little extended audit when we during this time. So I think we ended up finishing like a month or two later or something like that. But I think the benefit is having gone through the giant change once. Next year, I think we just said we would do it on like a Zoom call or something, and so we wouldn't even have to meet in person. There's no data center to visit, so why do you even need to come? So like I expect really good things when we do it again next year. Sad part is we have to do it again every year, and that's the draining part. And it's like, don't do PCI if you don't have to.
Remember that in one of the learnings, that was the very top learning in the presentation. Okay. We had a hand raised from Shangmin. So actually I'm gonna unmute the mic right now if you wanna chat directly, and here we go. Okay. Shangmin, your mic has been requested to unmute. Okay. I'll raise by accident. Yeah, it's a very big button to click. No worries. There was another question that came in. So what are some of the PCI requirements that are needed to show that a stack is compliant in the first place?
Yeah, that is a long question. But basically, and I'll take this from the SAQD perspective. There's basically 12 overarching requirements. I can share my screen actually, and just I got this doc up. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we got a PDF on the screen.
Yeah, awesome. So ignore that this is the non-compliant requirements section, but like these are the like 12 overarching paradigms of the PCI spec, and like install and maintain a firewall, don't use vendor defaults, protect stored cardholder data. And like that's very vague, but if you go back, you know, if you go into things like protect stored cardholder data, there's a lot of like sub content under that. So anyway, during the assessment, you have to basically provide evidence for each of these things on how you meet those goals. And you know, it's a lot of it's like business related process documentation. But like the thing that going serverless and moving to GCP allowed us to do was things like protect stored cardholder data, or like install and maintain a firewall. Like there's no network, which means that there's nowhere to put a firewall. There's no like, Etsy is not responsible for like some of the low level traffic coming in. So like we just hand them like Google's attestation doc for that. But like, and then just going into like protect cardholder data, like there's these different subsections, like our data retention and disposal policies, procedures and processes implemented as follows, right? So like it's checkbox items that if you had a database and you had a data center and you have to prove all this stuff. So like getting rid of our database allowed us to be like, there's no data to retain, which was a really core aspect of slimming down this PCI environment. is there a quarterly process for identifying and securely deleting stored cardholder data? Well, we don't store cardholder data anymore. We store tokens, and they're not even in the PCI environment. So there's no database to apply to this. So we could just be like, rule 3 doesn't really apply to us. So yeah, but there are 12 guidelines. And when you go from SAQ D to one of the other lower ones, I don't think the requirements change, but the things that like you have to prove are less. And in fact, it may actually reduce what they put here, since they know already that you're not required to follow those.
Cool. So I don't see any other questions coming in. Again, feel free to write anything in Q&A or raise your hand or type in the chat. But yeah, otherwise, we really appreciate this talk, guys. Anything else you guys wanted to share, maybe about what you're working on and, anything related to the presentation or?
You got anything, Aman?
No, I think we're good.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I would add that I wish I put in the presentation was the is how we approach, like, so when we use our PCI environment to like validate credit cards predominantly. We do like wallet encryption and stuff like that there. But one of the other biggest things we had to deal with was how do we prevent like a credit card from being validated twice, right? So we have end providers, and we want to make sure we only ping like their statement once. If you're looking at a credit card, you may see like a pending penny or something like that, depending on what the validation off amount was. But I think that was an interesting thing we had to solve for. And the way we solved for that was, obviously we still used our vendors' APIs for that, but like we only validate on the first processor that we send the card data to. On the second one, or anything after we pop the credit card number onto PubSub, we kind of rely on other APIs from our vendors to just tokenize without a validation. So I think that was a pretty cool thing. And it's something to think about if when you're dealing with multiple processors and you don't have the credit card number laying around, is how to like have a good user experience with the user statement. Because that's going to drive support volume and stuff if they see multiple pings on their credit card. So just another thing I'd bring up.
Actually, something to add to that is that if you are indeed going to do something like that, look into supporting things like 3DS, even on that flow, because 3DS 1 and 2 are going to become more like the norm moving forward. And supporting that or OTP type flows becomes more and more complicated once you actually have a system that works and try to like retrofit them into the system. So it's better to think about that when you're actually envisioning the system.
Okay, so actually another question just popped up. Neil just now asked, we actually recently outsourced the entire payment process to Adyen. We used to host Tokenize CHD, but have since turned down all EC2 hosts. They were recently notified that since they are PCI level 1, they're required, they still require QSA engagement. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this question is for Adyen or for us, but what I would say is anytime you deal with credit card numbers, you still have to complete a questionnaire, and it just depends on which questionnaire you complete, whether that be level 1, I think that's the SAQ-D level, or the SAQ AEP level. You still have to provide a questionnaire. So I can see why they would ask for it.
Okay. Then with that, this pretty much concludes our event. Again, thank you guys so much for this. It's been a little while in the making. Been really excited for today, but a lot of really good insights on your migration. Again, if you guys want to reach out for future events, if you guys want to present, on any particular topics or anything like that, we'd be more than happy to host that for you guys. I'm going to drop in the chat real quick one more time, clickable links this time. I think it was just manually typed by me, but feel free to sign up for our newsletter, check out our forum if you have any feedback, or honestly, just even follow us on Twitter, check out what we're doing on the development side. But yeah, if no other questions, really appreciate everyone. This has been a really great session. Okay.
Well, thanks, guys. Thanks, Andrew, for organizing it.
Yeah, this is excellent. I appreciate you guys' chat. So, okay, take care, guys. Have a good day.